everyone. Welcome to the UBC Learning Circle, hosted by the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. I'm very pleased today to be joined by Daryl, Karla Lewis, and Megan Dark. They're here to chat with us today about traditional foods, food sovereignty, and land-based actions we can all take to make our communities, our food systems, and our communities a little bit healthier. So thank you very much for joining me, guys. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and occupied territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle. So as a quick reminder to everyone participating today, the topics we cover can sometimes be sensitive or emotionally triggering. If that's you for today, if you know that that's you, please make sure you have your support system available. If you need to talk to a friend, elder, family member, counselor, whatever it is you need, please make sure that you're engaging in that. So, quick introductions before we kind of jump in. My name is Cole. I'm from the Chowthil First Nation, and I'll be facilitating the session today, which is mostly I'm just going to sit and listen. Other Learning Circle team members in the room but off camera are Cynthia, our production coordinator, and Kaylin, our program assistant. So with that, maybe I'll turn the mic over to you guys, and you could introduce yourselves briefly before we get started.
Ladies.
My name is Karla Lewis. I'm from the Gidimt'en clan of the Wet'suwet'en Nation, and I'm currently working at the First Nations Health Authority as a traditional wellness specialist in the northern region.
Ladies first. Avanadas Gazoon, and good morning. My name is Megan Dark. I'm a population health dietitian and an Indigenous health dietitian with the Silcotin National Government and Interior Health Authority. Thank you for having me this morning.
I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional area that we're on now, and UBC for putting something like this together. My name is Daryl. I'm from the Tidingoti Nation, and I'm a proud member of the Black Nose family.
Great. So I understand that we have a presentation today. I think we can just jump right into that, guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh.
There we go.
Daryl. Oh, right.
You get the clicker?
I'll click through.
There we go.
Vanna White. So we introduced ourselves already.
Just bladder.
Yeah.
Really, this is so important. Like the topic we're talking about here today, traditional foods, and it's overdue as far as I'm concerned. And the traditional territory where I come from, is how we survived. It's how we lived. It's made us who we are, and we're from a warrior nation that we needed that area that we called home to survive. And it, like I said, made us who we are. The food that comes from that land, and we need to get that back. Is what I'm saying. I was raised in the mountain by my grandpa, who kept me from like the residential school things, and it made us stronger, I feel, and it's that kind of information, knowledge needs to be put out there for more people to take part in living the healthy lifestyle. It's the food is food is power is what I was taught, and nowadays it's never the same. There's no food like the old food that Gran used to cook and put the effort and the time into, and gathering, collecting. Like I said, we lived in mountains. We did the seasonal thing. We followed the food, and we never needed anything. We never wanted anything. We never needed anything. We were so healthy. We didn't have doctor appointments. We didn't have a dentist to see or anything like that, because of our lifestyles. And it's just so important, and we just need to get back to it and more. I don't know what it's going to take, but this is the first step, and I'm glad to be here and to talk about such an important thing. We did everything from collecting, gathering, hunting, fishing, and we did good. We lived like kings in the mountains, and we ate like kings, and we thrived, and that's what's missed nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
Not only for us, but I've worked with some people here from the city here, and they're saying that they're too urbanized, that they're really in need of the healthy foods like themselves, and so I'm hoping this gets out there and gets to be discussed more and looked at, because it's, and I don't know if we want to get into industry yet, but that's the very reason that we're in the boat that we're in. Our territory has been devastated, destroyed by industry, and from forestry to the fish, to almost anything and everything that we specifically use to survive on are now gone, or close to being extinct. And as far as I'm concerned, it's all on the provincial government's hands. They've been doing this for so long, and it's time to I don't know what we can do, but it's time to do something for ourselves to take care of our own land and get back to what we used to be. Like, as far as I'm concerned, they had their chance. They destroyed everything. Now it's up to us to put it back together and get back to who we are. It's all for the, like, when you see these things and then people say, oh, you're taking away jobs, you're taking away this, you're taking away that. But when they take all the trees, then whose fault is it? When they take all it's a two-way street. They can't be saying, oh, First Nations are just costing us jobs. The industry, like I said, they're what destroyed our territories personally. Like, my specific area has been devastated, destroyed. They took every tree in our area. We had the most beautiful rivers, glacier rivers and lakes. They were just loaded. We like I said, we thrived, and now we're just scrounging. The hunters that are out there, we have to work extra hard just to get a healthy meal. And it's all, as far as I'm concerned, it's what I don't want to. It's backwards. Let's say, for an example, the DFO. They come up there and they regulate us, take the dip nets out of our hands, but yet over here in the oceans, it's free for all. They're unregulated. They can catch anything they want, and things like that need to be changed. And we've taken it upon ourselves to start the process of some of these things out Stella, where I currently reside, and with their great leadership and support, we're dealing with this on our own without any input, or we're not waiting for anybody. We've literally just drew a map on a line on a map, and we said there'd be no more moose hunting. The mushroom thing, we just ran everybody out. Said this is our area, and we made notice. We put it in we made it public, so people would know that we're serious and it's time to do something. And I think many other people need to be thinking about this, considering this, and as far as I'm concerned, I'd like to put a word out to all the current leaders that are out there in the province to unite, work together, and put this government in check, like when it comes to our traditional area. We need to be actually stepping up and dealing with this.
Was, if you don't mind, Daryl, the mushroom permits? I didn't hear much about that. What exactly is it? Was it were you guys like regulating the number of mushrooms that could be picked, or what did that look like?
Our nation was, but my specific community, Estela, we just said zero. We didn't allow one person in there. you said, because the previous year there was a fire, but it wasn't this significant. It was smaller, and there was campers up there. Non-natives were up there. They made a big camp. They made a big mess. And then when the Muslims were gone, they just left. They left their tents there. They left their garbage there. They left everything there. And like I personally had to go up there and clean up. So the year after, when this fire came, I was the leader on the mushroom thing. And said no. And I'm not on council. I'm not, but, but I can make decisions, and that's what we did. And I patrol it. With the ATV, I patrolled every square inch of our area and made sure that no one came around. And it wasn't authorized. There's no mushroom law in Canada now, as far as I know. And we just did it on our own. And no one confronted us. No one. And then when I forget, somebody said, "What? They're not going to listen. They're going to come. They're mushroom pickers are coming." I said, "I'll be waiting." But it's just things you have to do, and we not only have the right, but we have the power to do it. And I think we should be doing it, and enough sitting on our hands, and we need to get away from the system that was implemented on us. We need to be who we are, not sitting at home waiting for a social assistance check to come in once a month, and then head to Walmart and buy stuff that's grown in labs in China. Like that's just not it can't happen anymore. And not only we need to see this, but the whole people need to see this. Food security is a big problem. It's being addressed by everyone, and because of climate change, because of there's so many different reasons, soil, everything. Like I work in agriculture and I know with a lot of different people, and it's serious. It's a serious problem, but nobody's really talking about it. And I can't wait till the day that something happens and it comes time to survive, and then maybe that's what it would take for people to wake up.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to have conversations about food sovereignty and food security when not that it's difficult to have those conversations, but I think it's difficult for nations and communities to take action sometimes, particularly when you're talking about industrialization of their land, or in this case, like down here, we have a lot of urbanization of land, and it just physically doesn't exist. You know what I mean? Like green plots don't exist. But I think, it is important. And in this case, the nations, the territories that still have their land need to lead that charge and show the others kind of how it can be done. And I don't mean to be specific to geographical regions, but typically in the north, you guys have more green space than we do here in the lower mainland.
And to add to that, the people from here are coming north looking for areas to grow. Like and we're going to draw the lines. When it's time you guys made your mess, you can grow your own food. Yeah, that's what it's going to come to. And then not only that, we have our land, sure, but it doesn't make it easy.
No, of course
have loopholes to jump through. We have a provincial government system that keeps us suppressed to almost nothing. They make it so difficult, so hard for us to do anything. That's the very reason we do a lot of things out of our own hand, our own pocket, we make our own decisions, and we're one part of 6 of the Trincote Nation, but sometimes we, like the boss man there, when he pulls the trigger, we do it, and we don't wait for anybody. We just get it done, and we make our own decisions, and we live by them.
Daryl, can I chip in and just say that while I see Estee Lauder and the nation itself exerting authority over your lands and kind of taking action into your own hands like you've talked about, I think something I've observed about how Daryl operates, as well as he's doing that on one hand, but on the other hand, he's very strategic in who he's building relationship and partnerships with as well. Like Daryl is frequently traveling to Vancouver and Victoria and meeting with ministers of different levels of government and working with ministries to move things on that side as well, and looking at reshaping policy and just making sure that his nation and his community's voice is really heard. So I just see that as really strategic and just so great in that you can kind of be on the land and exert your authority on your land, but also be working at kind of that policy level and trying to create some change there too. And I think it all kind of, ideally comes together in the end for land sovereignty for the nation and for your community.
Mm-hmm. And for others as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Setting precedents and making sure that we get policies changed is only good for the benefit of all of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think policy is where, I don't mean to be radical here, but I think policy is where a lot of colonial action still takes place today, and I mean that's where it's exerted, is in courts of law and branches of government, and that's one of the big pieces that keeps us from as independent nations, as being sovereign nations. We talk about a lot. And yet we face discriminatory colonial policies that make these things difficult, like land use choices. It should be ours, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we're sovereign nations, if we want to talk about reconciliation, then the choice is ours, period.
Mm-hmm.
But
and for an example of about, I don't get too much into politics and all that stuff, but anyways, our nation specifically has taken on the federal government in court more than once, and we've been successful in protecting our area, but yet the provincial government turns it over and takes us back to court. Like, what's wrong with that? Like, like I said, in my lifetime, I'm really looking forward to the provincial leaders to take over and, like I said, put the government in check, and this is our time to do it. When they throw the word reconciliation out there, but we have yet to see any single piece of it yet, and it just shows you how, I'll use the word corrupt and ignorant, and the process is. Like, to this day, my warrior chiefs who fought for my land so hard and fiercely, the government finally admitted they were wrong, but yet to this day they're buried under random parking lots throughout the province, and that's just not right as far as I'm concerned.
And to be honest, I think when we're talking about these sorts of topics, it can't exist outside of its relationship with politics and with industry. These are intimately related topics. So thanks very much for that work and bringing it up.
Daryl, I skimmed over some of your slides. I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to share, or any stories related to any of those photos that you brought to share.
Just the very importance of indigenous land and food. All the good food you see up there, it's hard to come by now, and some of them are like the fish, for example. With a landslide, whoa, that landslide just sat there all year. The fish are there. Like, something needs to be done. Food is who we are. Food is food is so powerful. It's and that's why our warriors protected it like so hard. We had the best of everything. And now, after industry had their way with our territory, we're just struggling. And I really appreciate this opportunity to even bring this up to talk about, because as far as I know, this is the first, and it's so important that I don't know why it took this long, or people don't want to hear people just don't want to hear the truth nowadays. And I'm the kind of guy that will put the truth right in your face and let you know if I think it's what's wrong or what's right, and that's the kind of actions our leaders need to be doing.
The truth hurts.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks, Daryl. I appreciate it. I actually had one more question, just very briefly.
Mhm.
What would be, for those people that are watching from communities, what would be kind of your biggest, if you give one piece of advice to those people that are starting this journey in their own communities, whether or not they have a formalized branch of their, of their, we'll call it community governance, whatever that looks like, depending on where it is. What would be your one piece of advice for those people starting to take back their traditional land uses and establish food sovereignty in their communities? Where could they start?
It's a real simple answer to that, and I'll be quoting one of our chiefs who made a speech sometime, and I don't know how I remember these things, but just your question brought it up. But and it's just learn your culture, learn your language, learn your history, learn who you are. There's a lot of people walking around, First Nations people, that don't even have a clue who they are, and that's I feel so fortunate that my grandpa protected me, raised me in the mountains, and I have my 2 feet on the ground. I know exactly, like, nothing can surprise me, nothing can affect me, nothing, for that very reason. And that's the main thing. You can do everything you want, but you don't know who you are. You don't know your culture, your language, your being, your everything. That's the first and most important step, and that in itself will bring out the Indian in you. And then it's so important to know that, like, and our nation is, I'm going to say, most of our nation can still speak our language, and
It's amazing.
and try to live by our traditional ways, and especially my home community of Anaheim, where it's so powerful when you go out there. It's just the feeling of it. Yeah, that's what the people need to learn that, get that feeling back of home. It's like love. It's love of your home, of your. Some people, like, their love is just like a little house with a little room with a little kid and a job from 9 to 5, but it's so much more than that. It's, especially for an Indigenous person, like, they really need to learn their language, their culture, their history, where they're from, who they are, and study their ancestry.
It's a responsibility and a privilege to be part of a community.
Very much so. And, like, one of the kids says, my responsibility that keeps me there.
Right on. Well, thanks very much, Taylor. Appreciate it.
Yes.
Pass this over to Carla.
Thank you. Again, Denizite, Sakozite, Skyzite. My name is Karla Lewis. I'd like to thank the Musqueam for having us on this territory, doing this important work. And like you said, like, it's just so integral and so important to our culture and our very way of being. So I really appreciate you inviting us here to have this conversation today. So I'll go in a little bit more about who I am, although I really want to just jump right into the politics piece. But I didn't have that luxury of growing up in the mountains and in our traditional territories, at least not in a traditional way. I grew up on one of our lakes in our territories, but because of, like, all of the issues of colonization with residential school and 60s scoop, we were disconnected from our culture and our language, even though we were right there in the heartland of our territory. And so I kind of took the long roundabout way of coming home, of wanting to get out of Dodge as quickly as possible and get away, to going to university and taking that first First Nation Studies class kind of just as a fluke, and really beginning to see the systemic issues in our communities, and learning about our history and our culture, and, like, taking that first step, like you say, like, that we need to come back to our culture. So it's been a long journey, and a lot of studying and a lot of learning, and luckily a lot of, like, seeking out my elders back at home, and elders from across the globe that have been willing to sit and talk with me and give me teachings. to find my way back home again. And so when I had my little boy there, you can see Levi, it was important for me to bring him back home to our territory. We'd been living in Victoria going to school, and so I brought him home to our Wet'suwet'en territory and wanted him to be raised in a way that he can learn those things as a child, instead of having to take the long way of identity searching and things that a lot of us have had to go through. So we've been pretty successful at that. He's there's things in Levi's life that he just takes as normal now, that he knows that he's Wet'suwet'en. He knows that he can go out onto the lakes and go fishing and spend time out on his territory. Those are just things that are normalized for him. And so I guess that's the key focus of my presentation is how do we make that how do we make that a normalized part of our everyday lives? Mm-hmm. You touched on so many important pieces of our contact, our culture pre-contact was around food and food security. Like our very cultures are intrinsically linked to the foods, to the salmon in the waters, to the plants on the land, to our medicines. Like our seasonal round, our daily existence was around food, and our culture stemmed from that. And I think that's what we need to get back to when we're talking about food security and food sovereignty is how do we make it a part of our everyday lives again? So we've kind of been on that journey for quite some time, and I'm really hoping to incite, I guess, an Indigenous foods revolution, like get everyone excited about integrating foods into their lives again. We all eat, but like you said, like it's going to Walmart or going to the grocery store and getting these foods, and our family has kind of become a bit of doomsdayers or preppers or whatever you want to call us as well. So we're always talking about how to make sure that we're not relying on the grocery stores. And maybe it's not even preppers, maybe it's just going back to our Indigenous ways, but making sure that we aren't totally reliant on the grocery stores. And so pretty much every aspect of our lives now revolves around harvesting and collecting and learning about our traditional foods and growing plant foods as well, which I'll talk about later. But being able to bring those values back, our relationship to food. Like we didn't just go out and throw a line in the water and catch a fish. There was like ceremony involved. There was ways that we celebrated and honored the relationship with our food sources. We respected them when we handled them, and we didn't waste them. Like we didn't just throw things around and make garbage heaps all over the place. So it's those values that are really easily translatable into the contemporary context that we can bring forward with us and make sure we're respecting our food and building those relationships, not just with the food, but with the land itself, with the water, and now with the air. So I think you've touched on this a lot as well. Like there's just no plan B. The issues of climate change, the land being destroyed has just been so damaging to our food sources. The agricultural industry, that's like one of the biggest polluters and taking over the land base. Polluting our waterways. Like there's just so many damaging impacts. Like you can see, like when we go out onto our territory, like we're lucky we do have a huge territory that we can access, but every single time we go out to go berry picking or whatever, there's a new clear cut and we have to find a new spot. And of course now there's a lot of industry activity in our territory, and so we've been able to go out and make sure that we're teaching our children and we're doing these things, we're getting out onto the land, and we've been able to do that freely until it becomes a problem and we're not wanted in that spot anymore. And so these places where we used to go and pick berries and hunt and trap and fish and trying to revitalize that for our children, we can't even access anymore. Like there's actually like a RCMP presence in our territory as we speak, that we can't go to those lands anymore, at least not freely. And so we've been trying to see, now I've just jumped right into the politics. But we've tried to do that and be like, yeah, well, it's intrinsically linked to politics. Like that's why we don't have this food security that we're aiming for, right? So we've tried to do all of those things like that you mentioned, like, well, we're just going to go do it. We're going to take our land back. We're going to go and live as Indigenous people. We're going to learn those things. And then it's just like an iron hammer comes down because we're in the way of development. And so that I don't know the answer to, but we're just continuing to make sure that we're preparing ourselves and our family, and hopefully as time goes on, our communities, to have that food security no matter what, in whatever form that is. So one of, like I've touched on this a fair bit, but one of my biggest solutions, I guess, that I've been able to see is to teach our next generation. So a group of friends and I, family, we had started something called the Indigenous Life School when our kids were just babies, and we took them out of the public school system, and we taught them as much culture as we knew, connected them with elders. And as we're moving forward, because we needed to relearn that culture as well, we were relearning with the kids too. So it wasn't just like, teaching them, but it was everyone learning together and families coming together and relearning these important things. And so most importantly, like I said, was bringing them back to the land, teaching them to have that love of the land, and honoring their time and presence in the land. And teaching them those traditional values as we're moving forward. And so they would get these little lessons all throughout the day. And like I said, like my son doesn't, it frustrates me sometimes because I want him to be like, oh, these are the things I know, but it's just so normal for him. He's just like, yeah, I go out and I fish. It's simple as that. And then integrating the ceremony. So one story I wanted to tell was when Levi was 2 years old, we were out fishing in a canoe. And he's just a little tiny guy, and he has his little play pole, and he's hanging over the back, and he goes, I caught a fish. And we're like, oh, okay. And he's like, no, I caught a fish. We're like, okay, reel it in, thinking he's got a pretend fish. And so he reels it in, and he's got a fish, and it's his first fish, and he's actually caught it like all by himself. And so we made a big deal out of that. And in our tradition, your first catch you give back to the community. So we had a big dinner and a big celebration, and we gave his little fish out to everyone. And we've just made sure to keep that
cut into tiny pieces.
Yeah, a little sliver for you. Yeah, but anything else that he's caught too, and the other kids that are involved in the life school, making sure to keep those traditions alive and building the ceremonies as we go, because we're learning them too. And then always making sure that he knows that he's a provider for the family, and really honoring and lifting that up, and making sure that he knows that that's an important part of who he is. And again, making it a part of our everyday lives, like canning and drying and harvesting, and like all of those things are just things that we do normally now. Like it's just part of our life cycle, I guess you could say. And then again, on the last note there is teaching them to defend the land in all of our relations, because we have a huge burden as Indigenous people that we don't just have the luxury to go out and do it and enjoy the land and have a nice day out fishing. We have that burden to protect our lands and protect our culture and fight for our rights and title. And so these little guys, like we're not throwing it all on them at the get-go, but teaching them as they're growing so that they're prepared for that, because we got thrown into it without a lot of knowledge. So these are just a few more pictures of our little guys in the Indigenous Life School. They're out making fishing weirs, they're out berry picking, they're learning to harvest and hunt and trap. And you can see my cousin Molly's son there, Liam. He's got a great big knife at his age. And so one of the things that we do too is teaching them not just about the foods and how to get them, but those skills that they need, those traditional knowledge skills, and where to go and how to harvest, how to use the tools. You can see they're creating tools from our traditional woods. And there's Liam also poking his head there through a fishing weir that we had made. And again, like we're going through with them, learning these things and seeking out our elders that can teach us. one of the things that we're doing as well to supplement our traditional foods, and I guess I should mention too that one of the things that we make sure to do, like we make sure that a majority of the meats that we get are either bought locally or they're traditional meats. So we're supplementing that with plant-based foods from the forest, of course, but also from growing some of our own things in my backyard. And so one of the things that's really helpful in food security is, and from an Indigenous point of view, is permaculture design. So I won't go into like all of the principles of permaculture, because it's kind of a different topic, but that's really important for us to be able to supplement our foods in that way. So I don't have a huge place to call my own, but it's a lot more than a lot of people in the world have, and we're trying to turn that into a food producing mecca. And so you can see here we have just started building a passive solar greenhouse and had it going all throughout the winter. Last week it was down to minus 40, and it got down to minus 10, but minus 10 in the greenhouse, but it's just a way better principle for instead of trying to use the old just plastic in a frame. So it's totally insulated, uses the sun, and then throughout the land we have a huge vegetable garden, and we're growing herbs and some of our traditional medicines, and trying to reclaim my lawn. So there's kinnikinnick growing all over the place, and mint and different things. So and then you can see on the other side there, we're combining our traditional foods with the things we're growing. So usually, and especially in the summer, we barely have to go to the grocery store. Yeah, we can't give up cheese, so we're still going for cheese. But yeah, the grocery bill is super diminished. And I think that's kind of like the goal. Like, how do we get out of that reliant space from the grocery store? Especially in times like with climate change, the price of food is going to skyrocket in the near future. So how do we prepare ourselves so that we're still getting quality, nutritious food? My last slide is at the very end now, I think. But yeah, if there's any questions before I carry on and pass the torch.
I actually have a few questions.
Yeah.
The first one being, as someone that transitioned from like an urban lifestyle into, like as an adult transitioning back into there and trying to bring your family into these traditional indigenous foodways, let's say, what do you think was the biggest challenge for you guys? Like, as yourself as an individual, but as a family? I would imagine that transition is not easy. Mm-hmm. And I'm speaking for myself, but many other people, it's almost that it almost feels daunting when you're standing on one side of it to say, oh, well, let's go and grow our own foods, and let's go and gather and participate in food sovereignty. And these are huge, huge things for one person or a family to take on, right? So, but you're somebody that's obviously done that and continuing that journey. It's always a journey, but what do you think was the biggest challenge, and what was maybe the best reward?
I think just that knowledge seeking was probably the biggest challenge. Like it definitely wasn't something that happened overnight. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the things I want to stress in all of this, is that it's not something that can be just like in one little program or one little service that we're providing to our communities. It has to be like this kind of overarching like life change, so that you're constantly seeking this knowledge to learn and grow. So before I even went back home, I'd started dabbling with like growing things in little boxes on the little porch that I had, and trying to get my green thumb going, and learning about the culture. And so by the time I had gone home, I had studied so much, and my knowledge was very book based, and like had been in the academy, and I found like going back home, that transition to community and everyday living was like a tough transition to go through. I find in the academy we romanticize a lot of the past, and there's definitely like amazing things that come from our culture, but then when you go back into the everyday life, you're dealing with things like lateral violence, poverty, disconnection from land, the influx of a capitalist system where we're having to work 9 to 5 and you're not being able to spend that time out on the territory. So immense challenges.
It's a balancing act.
Yeah, a balancing act. One of the ways I did it personally was I only worked part-time for the whole while Levi was doing the life school full-time. He's actually gone back to school this past year, but he wanted to make sure that he could still life school in the evenings. I'm like, oh yeah, I can do that. But I worked part-time, and that was a huge challenge, not having like a full-time economic structure for myself. But we just chose to live differently. So we weren't just buying like all crazy and spending like mad. We lived within our means, and we cut back. And plus, I was used to living on a student budget anyway, so we just stayed on that budget and still on that budget. So it makes it so that we're not just constantly struggling and trying to make money. And so I think that was one of the big things. And then reaching out and rebuilding those relationships with our community is an ongoing challenge, and finding our family and finding our tribe kind of thing. And then some of the successes, like it's just, there's been challenges for sure, but the successes are just every day. Like my son is proud to be Wet'suwet'en. He knows his culture, he knows his land. We try to learn our language, and like he's just a healthy and well person, and I find that for myself too. Like we're living well, and so I want other people to be able to do that as well.
Yeah, sure. It's congratulations. That's so awesome to hear. And for myself, it's just what I've done most of my life, anyways. And I missed the part about my boys. I'm glad you brought it up, because I have boys that are trained right up there. They're hunters. They live off the land as I do. They have jobs, they live other places, but they know where home is. And just that interaction with them and the land and where you come from is the biggest reward you can't beat that. You could be the most successful person in Vancouver, the richest person in Vancouver, and I'll still be happier than you, living out at home with my boys off the land. And that's just as simple as it gets.
Yeah, I think that's it's really important to so thank you very much for bringing that in, is that generational piece, and recognizing that the work and the actions that we do here and now towards this impact the generations tenfold, the next one and the next one down. And it was a thought that struck me when you were talking a lot about being protectors and providers, and kind of gradually easing the next generation into that role. And I think there's a piece that we have to recognize too, is that the work that we do here now makes that easier for them. I dream of a future where, yes, they're protectors, but that they don't see that as being in direct conflict with the colonial society that we have now. Do you know what I mean? As a generation or even two down, is that it becomes an accepted reality that Indigenous people are sovereign nations with our own food systems, and that it's, you know what I mean, that doesn't become like the big story on CBC every time that we want to exercise it. Do you know what I mean? Yeah,
for sure. I totally get it. And you hit the nail on the head for sure. It's the way to think. I'm not here to start something.
Yes, you are.
You always start something. Cool. Well, thanks very much, Karla. I appreciate it. We do have a question for Karla. Are you involved with any community-level projects to address food security in your community? And if so, what are some of the challenges you and your community have experienced? So I guess taking more of that communal lens. Well,
I'm glad you brought that up. So as I mentioned, I work for the First Nations Health Authority, and my role there is as traditional wellness. So I get to work on amazing projects around integrating traditional ways of being into our healthcare systems, into our communities and everyday lives. I've been focusing a lot on traditional healers and how they can be strengthened and lifted up in our communities. And then I'm working on some land-based healing projects. So this is across the entire north that these projects are going on, and so many of them integrate traditional foods into their projects, because it's just like such an important part of our culture and our wellness. But I think aside from that, in my everyday life, I've been trying to teach as much as possible. Anyone who wants to listen, like, and a lot of times I go out alone, or it's just me and Levi. But I think it's a growing movement where people are getting interested in this. So if we go out to harvest medicines, or if we go out to pick fiddleheads in the spring, or do whatever, we try to bring people with us. And the group of friends that I'm working with Wet'suwet'en, our family and clan members, they do that as well. You can see a lot of that happening out at the Gidimt'en village, out at Unistoten, where they're bringing people in to train them and teach them and get them to have that opportunity to spend time on the land. And then also with FNHA, we've recently hired a dietitian, Marissa Alexander. Hi Marissa, if you're online. And Jess Hart as our food security coordinator, and hopefully doing some really focused programs in the near future around food security.
Cool. Sounds like a lot of great initiatives. It actually brought up a question that I had as well. When we're talking about when you're talking about gathering traditional medicines or traditional foods off of your territories, do you do so and kind of strictly focus on your family unit, or do you gift any of those things to elders in exchange for their knowledge? Or because when we're talking about traditional food systems, it's intimately linked to a traditional form of economy, right? In the sense that elders pass on their knowledge, then you would pass on a gift, whatever that is. Yeah. And there's a lot of different communities interested, so I'm, listening, so I'm not going to say what that gift would be, because it would depend on who you are and where you come from, right? But, so I guess that would be my question, is through this process, particularly as it relates to the Indigenous Life School, then, did you try and participate in the traditional-based economy in that way, or kind of how did that process work when seeking out these knowledge keepers?
Definitely, we do a lot of trading. Trying to think how that actually works. It's like I said, it's kind of just become normalized.
It's more just natural thing to do as being Indigenous, is to respect your other, like the other Indigenous tribes we're formed from trading and bartering. And that's who we are. And like I tell Megan, it's Granny's rule to gift and trade, and it's
and I think on top of that, not just the products too, but that knowledge is one of the things that I'm really trying to trade. So trading skills to different people, like with people teaching me that I pay it forward and I teach. Like I'd actually worked quite a few years ago with the late Dr. Sophie Thomas, and she had just really stressed, like, you don't hold this knowledge to yourself anymore. You have to pass it on and carry the torch. And then other elders that I've had the luxury to spend time with, the late Gustaway, Alfred Joseph, on our traditional territory. He said, well, I'm not going to live much longer. This is your responsibility now to pass this knowledge on, to protect this land. And those are things that I take really, really seriously. And like I said, just trying to pass that knowledge, the knowledge exchange, along as well.
Okay, so we have quite a few questions kind of coming in here now. I think this one is for everybody generally. Rick Joe from Lilwat. Hi, Rick. Many of our students are not connected to their traditional lands as a teacher in the Chilliwack School District. Any support for public schools' Aboriginal student population? And I think framing that question in terms of like perhaps what would you suggest would be a good step for schools? Have you guys done any work in schools, with either within your nation or in the local areas?
I wouldn't say in schools, but at home we try to. So I don't know if any other.
I've done a fair bit with the schools, but a lot of that is just volunteer based, and so the different grade levels will call me in, and I'll bring the kids on either medicine walks or learning about their lands, doing a bit of work about connecting to the land, and then hopefully in the near future we'll be doing some of actually harvesting and different things like that. But it's all totally volunteer based, and so what I would hope to see in the public school system is just bringing in those people, making sure that the elders are brought into the classroom, that the people with that traditional knowledge are brought in and spent time with the students, and especially the Indigenous students, so that they're doing kind of what we were doing with the Indigenous Life School, but doing it in the classroom. Like my son was so heartbroken that he had to go to public school, but he just wanted it so bad for the peer aspect. But he's really, really craving that. Like now he's sitting in the classroom all day instead of whereas before he would be spending the day out fishing.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do we get that into the classroom?
I think we have at least one or two communities of our nation that have a school based in the community that do take part in traditional activities, but Megan might be able to...
Well, yeah, I was just thinking, Rick, that I think it depends on the district, and I think different districts allocate resources differently to like Aboriginal student support programs. I know in School District 27, there's a couple of Indigenous support coordinators that where they can help support Indigenous students with their nations, and if there is programs or activities, ceremonies, that kind of thing happening on the land. I guess a specific example I can think of is in Daryl's nation. There's actually a school in Honeygatine First Nation, which is about almost 300 kilometers from Williams Lake. It's quite a remote community, but they actually have a school district school right in the community where students attend. But every year they do a culture week, and they invite students from the surrounding communities and nations to come and spend a week on the land. They're harvesting mountain potatoes. They're learning about horsemanship. They're learning about making traditional tools and equipment, that sort of thing. So there's opportunities like that kind of come up and maybe aren't an ongoing continual program, but that students have an opportunity to kind of take part in. So, but yeah, I think it really varies by district and probably even by school. But I think there are opportunities, and potentially that's even something that FNHA in the future might even be able to support more of that kind of programming in collaboration with the education system.
Yeah, I agree. I think it has to be a kind of a collaborative effort. We can't just put it all on the school system, but certainly we can do. We can work to support them a lot more in making sure that this knowledge is available. I think another interesting aspect of Rick's question are not connected to their traditional territories. We have 300 Aboriginal students, and about 200 are not from this area. And I think myself personally, and this is, please correct me and jump in here, guys, but I think myself personally, growing up as an Indigenous person, not on my traditional territories, my mom was part of the 60s scoop, and we were relocated to a different part of the province. So I grew up most of my life in the school system in a different area. I was close to and a guest on the Comox Nation, which is kind of north central Island, I guess, Vancouver Island. So it's an interesting experience, but I always felt that I was welcomed by the nation and by the territory, and I think we all, as Indigenous people, myself, certainly, I don't necessarily distinguish between, particularly when they're youth, and we're talking about a colonial system that is purposefully targeting at trying to, or has been historically targeting at trying to isolate and estrange Indigenous families from their territories and from their families and from their communities. We all are a product of that system, whether we like it or not. So I think for myself, just moving forward with that knowledge of like, it doesn't matter if, I'm from the Chowthil First Nation. That's where my granny lives, and I think where your granny is, that's where you're from. But I grew up in Comox, and I was thankful and privileged to access a lot of different cultural teachings there, and it really had a positive impact on me as an Indigenous person, and helped me to come back to my own community, my own culture, my own teachings later on. What are your thoughts on that, guys?
I think it's getting to that point now where the Indigenous communities are more working together, and I know that because I sit on a board with I think there's 15 community chiefs that sit on a table agriculture table that I sit on, and they're all more than willing to share, work together, and to be stronger, just because of the loopholes and the hard work that we have to go through just surviving as Indigenous people. And that's why, like I said, I threw out the challenge out there for the leaders to work together and put this province in check.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I agree as well. Like, you learn where you're at,
Mm-hmm.
learn about the indigenous cultures there and the history. I've gotten a good majority of my teachings from traveling and visiting indigenous people in New Zealand, in Guatemala, and different places that have been so willing to share their knowledge. And then I'd also like to add that it's not just for indigenous people either. Like, hopefully it's
Mm-hmm.
every child gets that opportunity to learn about the history of their lands, the cultures, and also making that connection to nature. I think we'd live in a very different place right now if people had that connection to their foods and their lands.
Mm-hmm. So we have one more question, and then I swear we'll move on and we'll let you do your thing, Megan. So Nicole asks, what are your tips, suggestions to help bring food security, sovereignty to our community as a whole? As a family, we hunt and fish, but not everyone can or does. And how can we bring everyone together to embrace food sovereignty? And I think that's kind of touching a little bit on what we talked about before in terms of trying to bring back those traditional forms of trading and bartering in the community, because everyone can and will contribute in some way, at least in my opinion. Just because you don't have the physical fitness to gather doesn't mean that you can't embrace and benefit from that. That's my thought. What are your guys' thoughts?
I think just incorporating some of the community gathering around food sovereignty and food acquiring your foods. So some of the things that we'll do is when we unfortunately we haven't got salmon in the last 2 years, but when we do get a big salmon harvest, we've invited like anyone and everyone who wants to come. And so in my backyard, I have a big smokehouse that a group of us had built, and we have a big smoke party and a canning party, and let's just have like as many people and as many young people as possible, and get the young people just right in there, doing these things and just building it and just growing kind of that movement, I guess, and getting people involved, inviting them over, and making it fun. Like, we make sure that it's a fun time too. Like, so it's not just like you're sitting there having a horrible time. Like, it's everybody's laughing and having a good time, and just making it something that people can see as part of their everyday life too.
Very, very true. And another fortunate thing where where I'm from, we're so small that if we do something, we do it as a community. We're just too small for somebody to do something and someone else. We have to do everything together, and we do everything together, and we do the activities, we make it a fun event out of it, and it's not too big a problem where I'm from, but that's our trick. And it comes from the leadership down, from the bosses. The community's going to be doing this for this amount of time, then that's what we're doing.
And do you respect it? My question is kind of linked to that question, and I guess what I'm curious is if earlier you talked a little bit about the protocol around the first fish or the first hunt. Is there protocols in your communities around sharing food in general? Whether if you're hunting and you know that there's families that can't or don't, or is there kind of informal trading and bartering that happens where maybe they can't participate in those activities, but there's kind of community organization or protocol that comes together to kind of support those families too?
Well, for myself, where I did so much so often, I always have take care of myself and my family with traditional foods as much as I can. And when community members, families come, they come to my yard to shop, they say.
Yeah, totally.
So that's best I can answer that question.
I've shopped in your yard too, in your greenhouse.
Yeah, I think so. I think just like out in the world, it's maybe not as strong as it used to be, but that was like the heart of our culture and our economic system before, and especially for us as potlatching people. Our economic system was the redistribution of wealth, and so instead of like our hereditary chiefs and our clans members, they didn't show wealth by saying, "Oh, this is how much I have and how much I can collect." It's how much can I give and how much can I build up my clan members. So hopefully we can continue going forward with that. But on a personal level, me and my friends that are doing the food security movement, I guess everybody's trading amongst themselves, and especially with my garden, because it's too big for, you can only see a tiny portion of it there. but it's just growing exponentially, and I have so much food, like I can't even give it away. And so I thought also of inviting people over to do community gardens or whatever, and just do some of that training pieces. But yeah, definitely, hopefully getting more into the trade networks.
It's actually been tabled with the Agriculture Board that I sit on with the many chiefs and that of bringing back the bartering system, just to avoid the loopholes and the complication that the government has put upon us to, like we can't even sell a bag of potatoes, for example. So it's been tabled just recently, and hopefully we can get back to that and just survive on our own, do our own thing.
And on that trade network thing, one thing that I find really interesting, I can't remember the title of it right now, but it's something like the Native Northern Trade Network or something on Facebook. But everybody's always bartering and trading their traditional foods on there. So it's utilizing technology and social media to make sure we're trading.
So we have a question for Megan, but I think maybe we'll get through your presentation, make sure that we can, and then we can come back to that question.
And I think if it's a question I saw earlier, I hope I intend to answer it in my presentation, hopefully.
Cool.
So.
There we go.
So just by way of a little bit of context or background, some of you may have participated in the learning circle that Daryl and I were invited to attend a little bit over a year ago. And at that time, we brought, I guess, a message around the importance of decolonizing food security work and the importance of Indigenous land sovereignty. And so we shared a little bit of the story of the nation where Daryl came from. And when Daryl invited me to co-present with him this time, I really thought quite a bit about what I could bring to share. And I feel like it's so important to hear from voices like Carla and Daryl. And I was wondering what I could potentially add to that. And I guess what for me I thought of is that the question that I've been kind of trying to answer and still actively working on answering in my career is just really how to work in good and meaningful partnership with Indigenous communities. So I'm of white settler ancestry. I'm a second generation Canadian and grew up on Treaty 7 territory in central Alberta, and lived and worked in northern Saskatchewan on Treaty 6 territory with the Meadow Lake Tribal Council for quite a few years before relocating to British Columbia and working with a nation that I currently work with and Interior Health as well. So I have about 7 years under my belt of working directly with Indigenous communities as an Indigenous health dietitian. And so I think for me, it's, as many non-Indigenous people in this country just had such minimal background and really anything around Indigenous history and history in general, but definitely when it comes to food security in the land and all that story that we've heard a little bit about this morning so far. So I think I've been on a journey and I've learned quite a bit, and so I hope to share a little bit of what I've learned with those of you that identify as non-Indigenous and just how you can really build good partnerships and work in a meaningful way with the communities that you're invited to work with. So I do want to thank the Musqueam Nation as well for having us in UBC Learning Circle, and this conversation has been so great, and hopefully I can just add a few pieces here this morning. But also, as I said, I've been working for quite a few years in Indigenous health and have just had so many teachers along the way, and my experience has been that I've always been warmly and openly welcomed into communities, into homes, into ceremony, participating in activities on the land, like this medicine drive in Honeygatine a couple of years ago where we're picking noe or soap berries. And so I just really wanted to express my gratitude to everyone who's taught me, and one of them is sitting in the chair here at the Learning Circle. Daryl has been a vast source of knowledge for me and has shared so much with me. So I'm really eternally grateful for all of my teachers. So maybe, I guess a bit of a disclaimer is that I'm not an academic. My background really is just in the practical application as a dietitian working in communities. And so I really bring that lens. It's around sharing the things that have been helpful for me in working with Indigenous communities. And I think one of the most important things that I've done over the years has been to make mistakes and to, tread into unfamiliar territory and maybe say something that, I shouldn't have said, and been corrected by an elder and learn the proper protocol. So I think these are really just my personal lessons and what I've learned from listening and learning and making mistakes. So I know there's lots of really good research and articles and entire courses that you can take dedicated to this area. So hopefully I can offer something of benefit for people that are doing the practical work on the ground. So the first thing I just wanted to share is, and these aren't necessarily in order of priority, but I think when you're a non-Indigenous person working in this space, probably the most important thing that you can do is recognize that your role is in creating space and not taking it up. So I guess for me what that means, and it's also one of the goals of the UBC Learning Circle, is that the role is really to reflect what you're hearing from Indigenous communities and amplify it. Sometimes when you're a non-Indigenous person working with Indigenous communities or nations, you might even be privy to spaces where Indigenous people currently don't occupy space, and those are where you have the opportunities to take what you've learned from communities and just really amplify that and elevate those voices into those spaces. So it's not about adding necessarily your own voice; it's about taking what you've heard and bringing it there. So I really like this quote that says, "You can't add the eggs after the cake is baked." I think everyone knows that for decades, Indigenous communities have been either not consulted around things that affect their communities or their land, or their health in general, or they're brought in after 80% of the plan is worked up to, provide some feedback. And that's really just not the way that we need to be operating. We need to bring Indigenous people into our programs and our plans from the get-go. And in just the same way that you can't add the eggs after you've baked the cake, you can't bring in Indigenous people, as token feedback at the end of your project. So maybe that goes without saying, but I still see it happening sometimes. So we really need to make sure that we're bringing in our Indigenous partners from the get-go. Build relationships based on shared interests. So Daryl and I have worked together for quite a few years now, and I think there's a lot of differences in our background, and we've just really found that we have so many common interests when it comes to the love of food, the love of cooking, the love of being out in the land and harvesting and picking berries. And I think that was kind of the foundation of a lot of the good work that we've done together, is just spending that time, building that relationship. And
This might be a time you can tell them who's the better cook.
verdict's still out on that. I did teach Daryl how to wrap a grouse in bacon and cook it in the oven.
That's good. Anything wrapped in bacon is good.
It's true. It's true. So I guess what I wanted to share here is, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, that sometimes I think there's, you tread into territory where some of the conversations that need to be had are potentially a little uncomfortable or difficult, and the history of Canada and non-Indigenous and Indigenous people is inherently difficult and uncomfortable, I think. So I'm just suggesting that folks, non-Indigenous folks, be okay to walk into that territory and ask your questions and really come with an intent to learn and listen. I think creating space to have those difficult conversations is really how we move forward and start to learn about one another and work in good partnership. So the other thing I wanted to share is and Daryl and I talked about this as well, is sometimes if you're a non-Indigenous person working with Indigenous communities, you don't necessarily know where to start. And I think our Western education system trains us to, we come out of university as the experts in our given field, and we think we need to be advising and giving information and sharing what we know. A lot of the time, and this is from my experience and what I've learned, and it could be different for others, but a lot of what our Indigenous partners and communities need isn't so much the what. A lot of communities already have a really strong vision, whether it be for food security, food sovereignty, health promotion. Sometimes what the assistance that they need is more so around the how. So when we're educated in proposal writing and research and grant writing, that sort of thing, those are some skills that can really be applied when you come into communities and listen and do your best to translate for Indigenous communities into that kind of Western world of grant proposals or what have you. Does that resonate with either of you? And yeah.
Oh, yeah. Sure. She knows who's the boss. Let's put it that way.
So I think everybody that is participating in this webinar is already on this journey of learning about those beliefs and structures that really underpin what is a primarily colonial food system. But I guess for me, it's recognizing that when you're immersed in a dominant culture like we are in a colonial system, it can be really difficult to actually see the realities of that way of thinking and those systems. Sort of like the more immersed you are in it, the harder it is to see, like a fish in water. Mm-hmm. Not knowing what is water, it's just what's all around you. So I think taking the time to reflect and learn about Indigenous ways of relating to the land is really, really important. And acknowledging that those Indigenous ways of knowing and being in relation to the land are just as legitimate as any other way of knowing the land. Mm-hmm. So questioning, some of those values that maybe in Canada we hold strong around capitalist food system and private land ownership, and that the inherent value of land is in its maybe economic productivity, whereas Indigenous ways of knowing would say that all of the land has inherent attributes that contribute in different ways, whether spiritually or physically, to our well-being. So really take the time to learn and question, I guess, those values that we hold strong in Canada around the land. I think if you're involved in food policy councils or agriculture associations or those kind of things where you can bring in these critical discussions and bring in Indigenous people to speak to how they view the land and how they think about it, I think that that's something that can really help and propel change forward. This one comes straight from Daryl, Johnny, my sometimes boss, being willing to get your hands dirty. And I do mean that literally and figuratively. I think sometimes the idea of our scope or job description can get in the way of us doing really meaningful work with Indigenous partners. And I was just reminded by somebody recently, Fiona Devereaux. I don't know, Fiona, if you're here. She's a dietitian for a long time that worked in Indigenous health in Vancouver Island. But even the idea of having a scope in your job is a colonial concept. And it sounds like a cliche, but it really is a social construct, and it's something that we've just agreed upon, but it doesn't mean that it's inherently true. So sometimes if we can find ways, I think, to work with our organizations to recognize that, and sometimes building a relationship with community means not always doing exactly the work that's set out in your job description. Sometimes you just need to get in there and get some fish. I think I'll mention right now, and I've got a resource list later on, but something that a group of us have been working through a document. It's basically looking at white supremacy culture, and I think it's called Dismantling Racism, a Workbook for Social Change, if I have that right. But it basically outlines a whole bunch of different indicators of living in white supremacy culture. And one of them is an organization that is focused on those quantitative outcomes. So how many, the number of whatever it is that you're doing, are we moving kind of the widget on whatever it is we can specifically measure? So a way to kind of decolonize our work is to think more about what are those qualitative outcomes of our work with Indigenous communities, and how can we work with our organizations to focus on some of those some more. I think I have just one more. So this one I feel like maybe should be obvious as well, but I am reminded by some of my Indigenous friends that it is worth saying that when you're a non-Indigenous person working with Indigenous communities and people, don't assume permission to use that knowledge. Always cite your source if you do have permission to share. If you're shown a place to harvest or fish or gather, what have you, you still need permission to go back to those sites to pick those berries or to pick that medicine. Unceded or crown land in this country is unceded territory. So even just knowing where the band office of your local First Nations community is and going there and saying, hey, I know there's this great berry patch, it's on your territory, are you okay if I pick there? And getting a yes or no. And I think part of it is, that it's the right thing to do, but I think it's also in shifting the relationship non-Indigenous have with Indigenous communities and recognizing that inherent right to traditional territory. So asking permission to me is a way of really recognizing that Indigenous right to that territory. The last thing I think I wanted to share is just something that, this is an ongoing point of reflection for any health professional or other professional working with communities, is just asking yourself around the balance of what are you giving to this work and what are you getting. And sometimes I've struggled a little bit because of the inherent generosity of First Nations communities, where you come in and you're invited and people are sharing knowledge and sharing food and sharing stories. And sometimes it can feel like, well, I was trained to give to, knowledge or information or, for dietitians, it's intervention. We're trained to give interventions to people or communities. So sometimes you feel like, maybe you're not doing a lot in community, but I just wanted to remind people that a lot of your work, especially initially, is to just show up and listen and learn. Even if you feel like you have all this knowledge that you want to share, it takes some time, I think, until you can be invited to share that knowledge. And the most important step is just to spend that time listening and learning. So when you're trained to be an expert in your field, it can be kind of an uncomfortable situation for that to be turned on its head when you start working with Indigenous communities. But always important to reflect and get that feedback around, is what I'm doing with my Indigenous partners or in these communities what they need, and asking people like Daryl if that's the truth. And sometimes you get difficult, hard answers in response. And he says, nope, we need to do this. So this is kind of messy, and I think it'll be posted on the website afterwards. But I mean, your first and most important teachers are the people living in communities, knowledge keepers and elders, but there's also a lot of helpful websites and articles. And I won't list them all, but I do want to add just verbally one that was just posted last night to CVC Ideas podcast that I just really recommend everybody go out and download as soon as we're done this conversation. It's with Max Finday, who's from the Sweetgrass First Nation, and it's called The Promised Land. It was a lecture series at the University of Victoria, but he's essentially talking about reconciliation and how it's inherently and intrinsically and irreparably tied to getting the land back for Indigenous people. So really important listen. That's it. I guess that's all that we have. Sachanelia, and thank you for listening. I don't know if we have...
We have... So I think that we actually addressed the question. The question was from Seamus, and as a dietitian, how do you see your role in helping advocate for Indigenous food sovereignty? And I feel like we kind of addressed that question. So thanks very much, Megan. I'm going to do my spiel. It's an outro thing. If you guys have any last questions for anybody here, please populate the chat box while I'm doing so. I just wanted to say, again, thank you all very much. You all traveled very far to be here, and I appreciate getting to sit with everybody in a half circle in person. It makes a big difference. 3/4, yeah. So again, I really appreciate everybody's efforts in traveling down here. Coming up later on, or actually next week, we have sessions on pathways to physiotherapy. So a little bit about what is a community-based physiotherapist, what does that work kind of look like, and then how can you, as an Indigenous person, get into physio, basically, if it's something you're interested in doing. So be sure to tune into that session. It should be pretty exciting. And then we also have another session that I am totally spacing on right now. Right. We have, yes, yeah, we have a conversation on decolonizing consent and kind of all the things around that conversation. So that'll be really exciting. That one, importantly, is going to be later on in the evening. I know we normally do our sessions in the morning, but the people that were on the panel could not make a morning work. So that session will be in the evening. For anybody that's interested in participating in that, again, yeah, that session will be in the evening. So hopefully see more of you guys next week for those sessions. I'm going to do one last check here to make sure. We have one mention. Marissa said, "Hi, Carla. Thanks for the shout out."
Hi, Marissa. Hi, Jess.
So I think we've exhausted all of our questions for today. I had a really great time. Thank you all very much for sharing your knowledge and your perspectives and experiences. I feel better for it.
Thanks for having us back.
Thank you.
I'm glad Carla could join us.
Yeah, definitely. So until next time, we'll see you guys later. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.